ladies and gentlemen, keep it going, please, for Tony Rothschild.
Thank you, Satori. You might not know it, but Sunday is Father's Day. And it's also my 45th wedding anniversary. Thank you. I say that because I'll be at home alone all day with my dog, Benny. Because my wife is babysitting our grandchild in Massachusetts, and I just want to say hi to her because she's watching live stream. So I want to say hi and I love you. Happy anniversary. And my sister's actually watching in Costa Rica, so it is a worldwide event. But that's not my story. My father was an entrepreneur, a businessman, a wheeler-dealer. And in his leisure time, he loved sports, especially horse racing. He loved sports if he could bet on the outcome of them. And our summer vacations growing up in the 50s and 60s were either one of two places. We either went to Las Vegas, Nevada, so my father could gamble, or we went to Del Mar, California, so my father could gamble. And I really loved Del Mar. I love Vegas too. It's really fun for kids. I love Del Mar because we rented a beach house. And every day my father would go to the racetrack, and my mother, my sister, and I would go to the beach. It was great. On Saturdays, my father wanted a family day every Saturday. We had to do something together. So we all went to the racetrack. And, you know, when I was young in the 4th grade, my father taught me how to read a racing form. And I was really proud of myself. I went to school. I was the only student in the 4th grade that knew how long a furlong was. But my teacher wasn't impressed. So I grew up in LA, Los Angeles, and in a second-generation secular liberal Jewish household. My parents believed what the government said, and they strongly supported the government, as long as it was the Democrats were in power. My parents were very supportive of the civil rights movement, and they hated Joe McCarthy and his anti-communist witch hunts that ruined so many lives. But these events, for me, were somewhere afar, almost like watching a movie. I understood them. I understood the cruelty of what was going on, but it didn't affect my day-to-day life. Even in 1965, when my father went bankrupt, nothing really changed. You wouldn't have known that we had all these money problems. Life for us went on. It was kind of like I grew up in a bubble that my parents put me in, and that everything in that bubble would be safe. And I actually had a very happy childhood. In 1966, I went off to college at Arizona State University. I wanted to be just like my father. So I majored in wheeling and dealing. I studied hard. I got good grades. And I thought my father would be very proud if he knew I went to the dog track every week. And I loved history. That was my favorite class. And I had a great history professor who could tell very good stories. And on a particular day near the end of the semester, he started to tell a story about what happened after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, as we were going over World War II. And he said that the United States passed a law that required every Japanese American citizen on the West Coast to be taken from their homes and put in concentration camps. They called them internment camps. And I'm listening to this story, and my mind's going, this can't be true. He's a good storyteller, so he's probably exaggerating. It was very upsetting. because I grew up in California, great school system. I learned all about Father Sarah and the missions. I learned about the Holocaust, certainly, and how they rounded up a lot of Jewish people in extermination camps. But I never heard anything. It was only 25 years, prior that all the Japanese, there was a lot of Japanese Americans in Los Angeles that they were taken away. So I really thought it was an exaggeration. But I went back to my dorm, and that evening I called my father. And our conversations always, this was the spring, so the conversation would begin with the relative state of the LA Dodgers in the early season. And after that I said, Dad, my history teacher said something today. You won't believe what he said. Now, my father's a World War II vet. I figured he'd know about this. He said that they took in the West Coast, they took all the Japanese American citizens and put them in camps. That can't be true, could it? And my father said, yes, that's true. And to tell you the truth, I don't remember what he said, except that he confirmed the story. Because my mind just the injustice of it all, that it could happen, and that I would never hear about it, kind of floored me. It was maybe that first crack in my bubble, but it didn't break. Because soon afterward, finals, I got involved with finals. I had to pack up and go back to Los Angeles for the summer. I just put the story aside. My dad got me a job that summer parking cars. And the first 2 weeks, the company wanted me to work substitute at a gas station for somebody, which made me quite nervous because mechanics are not really in my skill set. But the day of my first day of work, I arrived early to make an impression. The gas station was a Chevron station on Melrose Avenue, and it was managed by a Japanese American man named Jimmy. And I was pretty honest with Jimmy that I knew nothing, and these days everything was full service. But Jimmy was fine with it. He said, you'll learn. And really, there's not much to do except fill the tank, open the hood, check the oil, check the radiator, check the battery level of the water in the battery, do it with a smile, clean the windshield, take the money, and off they go, and you wait for the next customer. And I conquered that job. About the third day, I was feeling really competent and like the expert gas station attendant. And Jimmy and I, it was a slow time, around lunchtime was always slow, and we brought brown bag lunches, and we were sitting on these kind of rusty, uncomfortable, I remember that, steel folding chairs. And I'm looking at Jimmy and I'm thinking about what my history teacher said and what my father confirmed. And I'm thinking, he grew up in California, I know he said that. I wonder if he knows about this. He was certainly alive at that time. Okay, I was a little naive. So I asked Jimmy to tell me about it, or asked if he knew about it, was aware about it, and he said, oh yes. Yes, I was 7 years old in 1942, and I remember my father telling me, you have to pack one bag, and those are the only possessions you can take. We have to leave our home and my job, and we're all going to report to this office. And Jimmy and his family went off to report to the Civil Patrol office, and there were a number of buses. And they put Jimmy and his family in the bus, and Jimmy said it was very scary because they didn't tell them where they were going. So they go off on a short ride, or maybe an hour, and they come to Santa Anita Racetrack. And they take them into the racetrack, and they put his family into a stall, which Jimmy thought was a good thing because the majority of the people had to be in, families were in tents in the middle of the racetrack infield. And I'm sitting there listening to this story, and my mind is spinning. Because Santa Anita was the place of my happiest moments in childhood. My dad had owned a racehorse in the late 50s. And he used to take my sister and I on a Saturday morning. We'd leave the house at about 4:30 in the morning to get to the racetrack for the morning workouts. And then we went into the back barn area, and you got to walk and cool off the horses, and they let us do that. We got to groom them and brush them. My sister and I got to put bandages around their legs. And I got the best job of all. I got to shovel the manure out of the stalls. But when I flash back on that, I never thought that a family would be living in those stalls just a few years before. And not only that, on all my visits to Santa Anita, I used to see the statues of the famous racehorse Swaps and the even more famous racehorse Seabiscuit. But I never saw a plaque that talked about the 19,000 Japanese American citizens that spent several months at Santa Anita until they were sent to a permanent location. Jimmy's family ended up in Utah for the duration of the war. Santa Anita, that they put barbed wire around the whole facility and guarded it 24 hours a day with armed military police. And not one of these people was anything more than an American citizen. My bubble burst at that time. And it was a pivotal moment in my life because my mind opened. Here I am with somebody that lived through social injustice. And it's a lot more impact when you hear somebody that lived through the story than your professor or even your father. And it had a big impact on me, to the point that it opened up my mind to the way I would have to be thinking from now on. Because this act was not done by a white racist Southerner or some right-wing anti-communist. This act was perpetrated by our government, a democratic administration, and had the tacit support of the American people. And now it's erased. So Jimmy told me the story without any anger. In fact, I think he was appreciative that I even knew about it, and he was very gracious about that. But for me, I'd have to start thinking of things differently, because now I'd have to question. I couldn't take, like my parents, I couldn't take, the word of the government. And this is in the 60s, so it was a time that everybody was questioning, and this was my push to start questioning. I went back to school, and in the next year, I decided to transfer back to the University of California at Irvine. I got involved in the anti-war movement. I got involved in the student protest and student rights movement. I graduated from Irvine, and I joined Volunteers in Service to America, that's Vista Volunteers. And they sent me to the Cass Corridor of Detroit, where I did community organizing in the Cass Corridor. And then after that, decided that I liked that so much I'd go to the University of Michigan School of Social Work. And after that, I began my 42-year career in nonprofit work. And my story could end there, except that it is Father's Day coming up, and when you talk to Satori, she makes you dig a little deeper. So what I did on that path, I always thought, was change my path away from my father and find my own path. So I want to go back to 2 years, January 8th, 1969, 2 years after my conversation with Jimmy. My sister calls me on the phone and she says, Dad is unconscious and they just rushed him to the hospital. You need to come home immediately. I jumped into my Volkswagen and drove at full speed on the San Diego freeway, probably 63 miles an hour. And I got to the Sherman Oaks Community Hospital at just about the time the doctor was coming out to tell my mother what was happening. And of course, I was debating the whole way, did he have a stroke or did he have a heart attack? The doctor came out and he said, Mrs. Rothschild, your husband will be fine. He took an overdose of sleeping pills and he can go home in a few days. And we just were stunned. I had no reference point. None of our family did. We looked at each other. Where did this come from? We saw no signs. We wouldn't even know what a sign is back in 1969. So I went back to school, and the next weekend, my father wanted us to family to get together when he was out of the hospital, and I drove home very nervous because we were going to have a conversation at the dinner table. And our family conversations weren't like Jeff and Mac's conversations. Our conversations were pretty shallow. But we were a close family, but we just didn't get into things. So I get to the table, and my father says, I want to tell you all that I did something really stupid, and I'm not going to do it again. And that was the whole conversation. And I was so happy. And I wanted to say, but I didn't, because that Sunday was the Super Bowl game. I wanted to say, Dad, you shouldn't have tried to kill yourself because you missed Joe Namath beating the Baltimore Colts. But I didn't say it. 16 years later, in 1985, January 2nd, which happens to be the day after my birthday, my sister calls hysterically. I'm in Detroit with our family. My sister calls hysterically and says, Dad died. I said, how did he die? He killed himself. He went into the garage and turned on the motor and died from carbon monoxide poisoning. You better come out immediately. So I got on the first plane I could get on. I flew out to Las Vegas where my parents were living at the time. We helped settle affairs, get my mother settled, and I flew back. It was a suicide note. We grieved, but we just went on with our lives. In 1990, 5 years later, I was finishing up my 10-year stint with Congressman George Crockett as he was retiring. And I got hired by Common Ground, which at that time was an organization of about 18 people. And I was going to be the director. And I was really happy. The motivation is I wanted to get back into human service, away from politics. And I wanted to be a director. You know, I'd been 17 years a social worker. So I thought I'd take the challenge. And, you know, Common Ground was a crisis center that mainly dealt with suicide and suicide intervention. And it really didn't play into my decision, and I really didn't connect my father's suicide with that. I didn't actually connect it for 20 years. But in 2010, I was in Chicago at a training. It was a training about how to tell stories and connect with your people in the community better so that they'll connect with your agency. And so I got one-on-one coaching from Terry Axelrod, who is the founder of this organization, Benavon. And she's with me and she says, so you have two roles as the CEO. So you have to give the vision for the organization, and you have to tell why you have passion to work there for 20 years at that time. And I said, well, that's easy. You know, I have passion because I work with some of the greatest people you'd ever want to be with, and volunteers, and we save lives every day in our organization and deal with the most complicated problems. It gives me just a great feeling every day. And she looked at me and she said, okay, but you've been there 20 years. There must be something personal that connects you to what you do. Can you think about that a little bit? And I'm thinking. I said, well, my dad killed himself in 1985. She said, I think you should go back and think about that a little bit and see if it's not more of a connection than you make it out to be. And you know that every day since that talk with Terry, I've been thinking about it. And I've learned two very important lessons. The first lesson has to do with this. I found this just before my mother died last year at 103 months. It's a Dacron tube, and she had it, she kept it all these years. I knew exactly what it was. In the early 1960s, my father went to Houston, Texas for vascular surgery, which was a brand new surgery. And he had this, you know, into his aorta and coming down to deal with his circulation problems. He took this everywhere. It was in his pocket all the time. And he would show everybody this Dacron tube. But when he tried to kill himself in 1969 with pills, he never took the pill bottle when he got out of the hospital and talked to anybody about it. And why not? It's because we have a society that looks at mental health as a second-rate disease, or mental illness as a second-rate disease. We are fine when people with being treated from the neck down, but we don't do well as a society when we're talking about the neck up. The second thing is that I hadn't said one word after that dinner to my father about his suicide attempt. And the reason I didn't do it was very simple. I had no idea what to say. So now, what am I doing in my life for the last 25 years? Every day at Common Ground, we're working in some way to educate people about mental illness and fight the stigma that our society has. And the second thing we do is we train people in what's called mental health first aid. It's an 8-hour training that any layperson can take. And it's very simple. You just get some very common sense tools, words to say to somebody that you see might be emotionally distressed. And the idea is to get them engaged in a conversation, and if they're not reaching out for help, then you have to try and connect them to help. And I know that if I had that tool in 1969 or any time before 1985, there would have been a conversation with my father, and I think he would have lived longer and a more fruitful life. And that's why it's important that we all need to learn those skills. So now I'm thinking, do you have to do what your father does to be like them? No, that's my conclusion. My father gave me a lens to look at the world. My father had a lot of integrity. He was very outgoing. He'd always be there to help his friends. He had certainly a different experience. He lived through the Depression than I did. But I think if he lived when I did, he'd be in the same place. So I conclude that I'm a lot like my father. Last May, I went to the Kentucky Derby. But I'm just going to conclude by saying I'm a chip off the old block, and happy Father's Day.